Then we are going to our closing keynotes. And we start with part one. We have two excellent speakers, Valérie QUINIOU and Leah NESSELHAUF, and later on, Anne-Marie Lovens. And to start with Valérie QUINIOU, I hope I speak that out in the right manner. Oh, yeah. And she graduated as a French engineer and naval architect from the École Polytechnique and the National School of Advanced Techniques 25 years ago. And Valérie started her career in oceanography and meteorology in the oil industry, then as vice president for climate change for the Total Energies Group. Since June 2019, she is the executive director of foresight and research at ADEME, notably in charge of steering the transitions to 50 perspectives exercise. A welcome applause for you.
I think I check where the slides are. I suppose it's here, right?
Yeah, Marta is coming.
It used to be here. Ben non, c'était là à un moment donné.
Elle était ouverte. Non, mais sinon, elle était ouverte en fait. Elle doit être ouverte.
Thank you.
Would you like to have the...
Well, yeah. Well, I think it's fine. Yeah, thank you. Well, good morning. Is it morning? Yes. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for having this opportunity to speak here with you. So the objective of my presentation is to speak about the long-term scenarios that we have developed at ADEME in order to, we hope, inspire or shed light to the debates and to the decisions, political decisions, so to influence decisions makers. So I'm indeed Director for Prospective and Research at ADEME. Maybe just a couple of words about ADEME that you probably know with Didier, but still. So ADEME is a French national agency for the ecological transition, depending now on actually 3 ministries in France, the Ministries for the Ecological Transition and Territorial Cohesion, the Ministry for the Energy Transition, and also the Ministry for Research and Innovation. We are covering at ADEME, I would say, a lot of fields which are necessary to achieve the ecological transition. So it goes from climate change to behavior change and mobilization through to expertise in buildings, mobility, agriculture, food, and so on and so forth. With a budget of about 1 billion in 2002, plus 2 additional billions as part of France 2030, which is the follow-up of the incentive plan following COVID crisis. We conduct our missions, which are expertise at the service of the public, the private sector, and also the collectivities or the territories. And we also, in addition to expertise, we also fund innovation through some calls for projects which are really targeting companies, private companies, from small ones to big ones. ADEME is composed of about 1,000 persons. I'm mentioning here because it's not only people with engineering expertise, it's also people with expertise in economics and sociology and also modeling. And actually most of the people in my team are from those fields of expertise. And I'm an engineer, but I'm really happy to see that sociologists and economists are, I think, really necessary to make the ecological transition ready and possible. It's not only a question of technology, it's also a question of how to achieve that with people, organizations, and so on. That said, let me switch to what we are doing at ADEME in terms of evaluation. I will not deepen that, but as you can see here, we are doing top-down, bottom-up, ex-ante, ex-post, and also in itinerary evaluations. And well, with Didier, I suppose you were able to see most of the work conducted, for instance, in Odyssée Mur, the European project Odyssée Mur. But we also at ADEME conduct some prospective work, which are in, I would say, in that box here, in order to evaluate long-term energy demand with modeling. And this is actually the main object of my presentation today, to present you an exercise which was published in, let me check, in November last year, November 2021, which is called Transitions 2050, and Design Now, Act for the Climate. So as you can see, transitions with an S, because we indeed wanted to propose several pathways to achieve carbon neutrality in France by 2050. Several pathways which are inspired from the ones that IPCC developed in their 1.5 degrees report in 2018. So we kind of applied the IPCC scenarios, or the philosophy of these scenarios, to the French situation. And that work started in 2019, and we had the objective to publish in 2021 for two reasons. First, to shed light on the debates prior to the presidential election. And secondly, also to feed the discussions, the work, which is now going on to prepare the update of the French strategy for energy and climate, and in particular to prepare for the third national strategy, a low-carbon national strategy, what we call in France the SNBC. And indeed, I would say the work that I will present here is used currently in working groups for that preparation. So I would say, again, the kind of originality of the work was to work on 4 different scenarios, really contrasted, and starting with a description of lifestyles. And this is why, you know, I made the remark about human sciences, because we thought that it was really important to start with a description of how life in France could look like in 2050, how we would, what we would eat, how we would live, work, how we would move from one point to the other. So really starting with lifestyles. And the second point is that in addition to energy and greenhouse gas emissions, we also wanted to look at the use of other resources, like the water, like metals and materials, and also the soil, the use of soil, use as a resource, because we are in a limited space, the French territory, and we had to consider some questions of how to use best the soil between building, between agriculture, and so on and so forth. We used for these scenarios mainly 3 levers, which are decarbonization, of course, because the objective is to reach carbon neutrality, but also energy efficiency, and last but not least, also energy sufficiency. And this is really, sufficiency is really one topic or one tool that we used most in our first two scenarios, which we called frugal generation and the other one regional cooperation. Energy efficiency is used in the first three mainly, while decarbonization is, I would say, used everywhere. Our four scenarios also have different perspectives on the type of governance that we use. We have quite a local governance in our first scenarios, while it's more global governance in our third and fourth scenario. Just as an example, for instance, our third scenario, green technologies, we have imagined that we could be in France with a strong government being able to make decisions on big programs of energy infrastructures like new nuclear plants or new big offshore wind farms. While on the other hand, in our first scenarios, it's more decision-making at the level of cities, of regions, and so on. And last difference between our scenarios is also the kind of impact. In the first scenarios, the idea is really to limit the impacts as much as possible and leave the Earth as it is as much as possible. While in our third and fourth scenarios, it's more a business as usual type of society where we try to really repair the impacts on the planet. And in particular, for the fourth scenario, with a large use of direct air carbon capture and storage, which is, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but which very briefly is a kind of way to capture atmospheric CO2 by, let's say, big fans, and then re-inject the CO2 in reservoir, in reservoir, yes. So CCS, carbon capture and storage, today exists on some industrial plants in particular where the emissions are quite well, could I say, are really at spots, so it's quite easy to capture. But DAX is something really quite uncertain today because it would mean really to be able to capture the atmospheric CO2 wherever it is. So it's for us a kind of gamble, a bet on the future, which is the main theme of, I would say, for our fourth scenario. I don't have much time to talk about these scenarios much, but I'd like to introduce you some of the key conclusions or learnings from that exercise. So one first learning is that carbon neutrality is possible for France. However, it's quite a difficult road. You can see on that slide that compared to the emissions of France today, we manage in those fourth scenario to reach carbon neutrality by decreasing a lot, of course, the emissions, but also by using natural sinks on our first scenarios or artificial sinks like, again, carbon capture and storage in mainly our third and fourth scenario. It's a difficult road because, in particular, if we want to reach carbon neutrality as soon as possible and avoid continuing to emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, the best way to do it would be to use strong measures on sufficiency, but probably by imposing it. So that's the theme of our first scenario, and it would probably lead to some difficulties in the society with certainly the population would be quite not eager to accept those decisions. On the other hand, the fourth scenario is also potentially a difficult road, of course, because the technologies that we are betting on actually do not really exist at large scale today. So it's possible, but a difficult road. And in addition to that, it means that reducing energy demand is anyway something important, anyway a first step to do. It's really a key factor, and it goes through, again, energy efficiency, but also moderate consumption. So it means that we need really to have a radical change of our productive systems. As you can see on this slide, the first column is the energy consumption in France today, or in 2015, compared to the target or to what we have managed to reach in our scenarios. And for instance, in our first scenarios, we need to abate by half the energy consumption today. And even in our fourth scenario, which is a kind of business as usual, you can see that energy consumption is also has also decreased by about 30%. That also is possible through the use of the circular economy to save resources, to reuse resources, or to recycle them. It also goes through the use of an economy of functionality in order to not only to sell goods, but rather to sell services. And through that types of efforts, we could also reduce our impact on resources. One of the examples I'm showing on that slide is the impact on water, irrigation water, which, as you can see, can really double or even more from one scenario to the other, depending, for instance, on the type of agriculture system we select. Briefly, some macroeconomic results. We have conducting a comparison with our macroeconomic model, and I won't get into much details here, but the red line is for our first scenarios. The black one is the business as usual, while the lighter blue or green ones are the second, third, and fourth scenario. What it shows here is that decoupling of the GDP growth is possible even in scenarios targeting the ecological transition. It doesn't actually have much impact on GDP, except maybe in our first scenario, which is quite based on constraint. So it's probably actually GDP is probably not the good indicator. So in terms of sufficiency, I'd like to open a bit on the type of sufficiency ideas that we have covered. It's not only reducing temperature, it's also for food, for instance, it's reducing the consumption of meat. It's also looking at more local consumption. It's also looking at reducing the packaging. So it's quite a big, I would say, or a large spectrum of topics that we have analyzed, covering sufficiency and energy efficiency together. For transportation and mobility, it's thinking of reducing car sales, and also, actually, if you buy a car, it's buying lighter cars, reducing travels, in particular by car or by plane, and switching to more foot or cycling. And for buildings, there are also questions of sharing spaces, in order to avoid empty buildings most of the time. For instance, vacant homes would be transformed actually in main residences. So a lot of possibilities in terms of sufficiencies, which cannot be dissociated, of course, from the question of inequality, and I'll come back to that. because we also questioned a small sample of citizens, French citizens, which are more or less representative of the French. I say more or less because, as you can see, it's only a small sample, so it's not statistically correct. But what it means is that basically people were, okay with all the four scenarios, thinking that the fourth was really a bit risky, more risky than the first three. And they were actually able to consider that they could go to more frugality or more sufficiency, provided everybody makes the same effort as themselves. So it's not only a question of individual choice. They also highlighted that it was a question of organizations, of infrastructures. I can cycle, provided I've got safe roads to cycle, provided I also can switch to a public transportation because I've got a long distance. Now, my last couple of minutes very quickly will speak about all the process, because it's not only, I think, the results of these exercises that is interesting for us, it's also the way we have conducted this exercise. So, as you can see here, it was quite a long process in ADEME involving about 100 people, starting with, again, stories, lifestyles, but then going to sectoral model for building, for mobility, for food, and so on. And then we had the integration of all the results of those sectoral models. And then, of course, we had to loop back, because by doing that the first time, we didn't reach carbon neutrality. So we had to go back and go back and go back. We actually did that, I think, 6 times. But it's interesting in itself because it actually led to some discussion, debates between our experts, such as, oh, you need biomass for food. Okay, but I do need biomass to create biogas. So, how much can I take? How much will you take? And so on. And indeed, in particular, the question of biomass was really key. Biomass is a resource that is limited on our French territory, and we have really to consider that the need for consistency between scenarios on how we would use biomass. So the discussion internally, discussion also with the outside world, because we had several webinars, sectoral webinars with private companies, think tanks, and so on, in order to test the robustness of our scenarios. And now that is published and finished, we are also now doing a lot of communication about it, probably not enough, but trying to target different types of public, the scientific public, but also politicians, but also the citizens with the use of podcasts, for instance, with a small video capture. So communication is also key to try to bring those messages to the public. Of course, all this is downloadable on our website here. So to finish, just a few words to follow that exercise. We are now also studying the inequalities between households in those 4 scenarios to see what type of impact it may have. Actually, the first result so far is that, a bit like the macroeconomic result, actually the 4 scenarios do not really differ between themselves and do not really differ between or with the business as usual. It's just a question, or it's more a question of richness, that the way it will be shared between quantities of household revenues, which is more, again, a kind of, sorry, I missed the word, but kind of parallel to the amount of richness itself. But forgive me about that. In any case, in a few weeks' time, you will see the results for that. We're also now going to another publication about public policy measures and instruments, because it's something that now we need to get more concrete for politicians, the type of policies that they could put in place in order to reach one of those scenarios. And also the territorial perspective, because we really believe that action is more closer to the people, closer to the territories, rather than at the national level. So, as I said earlier, this work is used in the preparation of the next French strategy for energy and climate. And last but not least, we also believe that observation and evaluation are really key now to have data in order to monitor the progress made against goals and to be able maybe to reset or orientate the policies. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for questions. And sorry for the time.
I have room for one clarification question. No? Then I think we can go to our next speaker. Okay.
Yeah, just maybe a quick question.
Go ahead.
Can you maybe comment about how in your S1 scenario where people actually don't have consume less goods, less services, but still you have a growth of GDP, because actually GDP should measure something, even if it's not the best indicator, and it seems for me actually incoherent. So can you comment?
Thank you. Actually, there are a few answers or explanation to that. In that scenario, we don't use, or we produce energy locally because we develop a lot of renewable energy, which has as a consequence that we don't spend money in terms of importing energy, and we actually create energy and produce more locally for that. It's also a scenario where we have imagined that we could reintroduce some industries in France. I think, if my memory is good, I think for pulp, paper in particular. So actually creating more also activity on that. And also it's an economy, again, which is more based on services rather than on consumption goods. So also the GDP is also based on the services in terms of exchanging really services between people rather than exchanging goods.
Okay, thank you. And then we are going to our next speaker, Leah Nesselhauf. She completed a master's degree in law with a focus on international human rights, social justice and environmental law in Hartford, USA. She joined the German Zero Climate Policy team in June 2020. As one of the lead authors, she co-developed a cross-sectoral meta-study containing the legislative proposals necessary to make Germany climate neutral by 2035. Since its publication in January 2022, her team regularly publishes monitoring reports regarding the government's climate policies. Besides her academic work, she is also engaged in conducting conversations with politicians and facilitating workshops for climate activists. Nice applause for Leah Nesselhauf.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy I can be here today. My name is NESSELHAUF, and actually I was kind of surprised when Christine Byrne called me a couple of months ago to ask me to speak here, because I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer, and I said, well, I don't do energy evaluation every day, and she said, I know that, but I would like you to talk about your work and how energy evaluation and our data fits in there, and that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to talk about why we need data for adequate climate legislation. I work for German Zero, and I'm going to give you a little introduction about the organization, because I think it's necessary to understand my background and the work we were doing for the last 2 years. German Zero is a pretty young organization. It was founded in 2019 and is a non-profit and politically independent organization. And its goal is to achieve climate neutrality in Germany by 2035. Yes, I know that's very, it's considered very radical, and it's a very challenging target, but it is necessary to ensure that Germany keeps its commitment given in the Paris Agreement to do everything necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And German Zero, as you can see on the slide, has 2 main strategic pillars. The first one is a policy and legal team working for better climate protection laws on the federal and the European level. And the second one is a team supporting referendums for achieving climate neutrality on a local level. And since I'm part of the legal team, working on the federal and European level, I'm going to talk about the first pillar today. So the starting point for our work in 2019 or the start of 2020 was that no political party has so far shown a plan about how to fulfill its commitment given in the Paris Agreement. And that's actually the case until today, that none of the political parties represented in our parliament has shown a plan, even though they all say that they want to keep the commitment given in the Paris Agreement. The second starting point was that we've seen, and I don't think it's an exclusively German issue, but at least it is an issue in Germany, that we've seen a very strong focus on individual behavioral change in Germany for the last decades, rather than on systemic change. And the instrument for the systemic change are rules, and rules for society are usually written into laws. That's why we decided to write this legislative package. And I'm not going into all the details of the development process for this legislative package, but I think it's interesting, or I would like to highlight 2 things about it. The first one is the immense body of knowledge we drew on. So we looked at over 1,000 studies that had come up with concrete policy measures. Basically what Valérie had talked about before, what you're going to do, that's what we did for Germany, for all the different sectors. And we worked together with around 150 honorary volunteers, honorary researchers and lawyers who looked at these studies, who processed the knowledge, and then we tried to combine different measures, look at which ones were regarded as the most effective ones, how do they interact, which ones can be combined so that we can achieve climate neutrality by 2035. The second point that I would like to highlight is our final product, which is actually like this legislative package, and it consists of draft legislation. So we actually wrote legal texts, as I said, together with around 75 lawyers, and also the grounds. So it is now ready so that it could be adopted by Parliament. To zoom out a little bit, I think what we did can be seen as a democratic process that has been developing in Germany for the last 5 years maybe, which started with climate marches, with young adults, children protesting on the streets. And then the movement called Fridays for Future, they actually commissioned a big study that was made by Wuppertal Institute, which is a big climate environmental institute in Germany. And they say that the study came out with findings that it would be possible for Germany to reach climate neutrality by 2035. And we then picked up this and said, okay, but if it's possible and no political party comes up with a plan how to do it, we are going to do it as a civil society movement. And as it seems like we need to do everything by ourselves, we're even going to write the laws. Okay. 2 things that I would like to point out about the package itself. So, of course, it's like, I'm not naive. I know it's a very, very complex task, and especially because it touches on all the different sectors. So our goal was to design a package that works, that thinks all the different sectors together, so that it would be cross-sectoral and actually designed in a systemic way. On the right, you can see the different parts of the legislative package, and I think it would be too time-consuming to tell all the different details about the measures that are included in the package, but these are the different pillars. And why is it called the 1.5 degrees target? Because we use the national per capita greenhouse gas budget for Germany as the reference point for our package. Yeah, that's what you can see here, which is, yeah, and I know you can calculate the national share using different methods, but we use, as the advisory council of the German government does, a per capita approach using 2016 as a basis. And here we see that we are actually running out of our national share, and even with our package, we assume that we would have to balance 1.9 gigatons internationally. What was kind of interesting was that while we were doing our work, this approach was actually confirmed by the highest court of Germany in its decision regarding the Climate Protection Act last year. It was a very unusual decision. It stated that the fundamental rights embedded in our constitution require the German government to ensure that greenhouse gas reduction burdens are not being unilaterally offloaded onto future generations. And that it also confirmed that the relevant yardstick to ensure compliance with this obligation is to take into account our national share in form of the per capita approach, and not as, and that's the quote I have on the slide, and not just simply as the German government argued to use some kind of degree targets. However, this decision came down almost 1.5 years ago, and we do not see this in any federal government action. So I regularly talk to politicians, members of parliament, ministry officials, secretaries of state. Some of them, shockingly, don't know the concept of the greenhouse gas budget or a national share, but most of them simply don't regard it as binding, which from a political perspective makes sense, because if they regard it as binding, they would have to admit that they are failing, at least on the course they're on right now. But it also means that the German government right now is kind of blindfolded in managing the climate crisis. That it is, as the court put it, and I think it's a very interesting quote for a constitutional court, that they are right now taking a shot in the dark. They don't really know where they stand, and they don't really know where they're going. So we from German Zero regard this as the biggest change necessary in German climate politics right now, that the German government literally starts budgeting its policies. Because they're not doing this, and this is the result right now. We have 2 gaps, one between our national share of the greenhouse gas budget, which would be about 1.9 gigatons, and the Climate Protection Act stating how much the German government wants to allow it. And on the left side, you can see the officially projected emissions. However, I have to say to this that this number only accounts measures that were announced until August 2020, and I'm going to say another thing about that later. So yeah, what are our challenges? So we from German Zero cannot implement these policies. These policies that we came up with, we cannot and we don't want to substitute the democratic process. That was never our goal, and we don't want to do it. So what can we do? As I said before, we talk to politicians, but apparently that's not enough. So personally, I think we will still need the pressure from the streets. And what we are doing is that we're communicating this necessary switch in the making of policies when we work with climate activists. And thereby we're facing different challenges. The first one is, as I mentioned before, that the concept, even for people involved with climate activism, involved with all these things, is still kind of unknown, and also that activists don't have the time to read 500 pages of publications. And because of the complexity, it's also kind of different to run campaigns about it, to actually bring it onto the streets. Yet I think their pressure is necessary to demand transparency and make politicians reveal their calculations or their non-existing calculations. So the second challenge we're facing is that scientists, and I know that's like a very generalized assumption I'm making here, but for example, Scientists for Future, which is a big organization in Germany, they are kind of hesitant or reluctant to come up with concrete policy claims to support, for example, what we found or what other organizations have found, in order not to risk their reputation. And I don't want to blame them, because I totally understand the motives, but it does not really make our work easier. The third challenge we have is that we are, as a completely independent and we are donations-based organization, we do not have the emission evaluation and accounting resources other big think tanks have. So it is, and I'm sure I'm not telling any one of you anything new, very difficult and very complex to measure the impact of different measures, and they're combined, especially in our case, if this package includes such radical messages like limiting the amount of emission trading certificates in accordance with the greenhouse gas budget, or stopping the admission of fossil fuel cars by 2025. And the last point, I'm just going to mention it briefly, is the time delay between the publishing of official German emission projection reports and the current development, because I think for managing a crisis, you always need to know where you stand and where you're going. And right now, for example, the latest data we have dates back 2 years ago. So that's how an energy evaluation fits into our work, and where we need good data to be able to come up with concrete policy claims. So thank you very much.
Now, please, Leah, take a seat. Perhaps there are some questions from the audience for clarification reasons or otherwise. Not yet, but Robert?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question is about the carbon budget for Germany, because I'm quite sure it has been calculated very deliberately with all kinds of very good assumptions. But I think in the end, it's a very static calculation, because the world is just turning around, and a lot of countries in the world are not yet complying with climate targets, and are still growing a lot in their emissions. And so actually, I'm afraid that the remaining carbon budget for Germany is already smaller than what has been calculated. I think the only way out, if we see the carbon budget as something which should be distributed in a fair way, allowing developing countries to grow, that the developed countries, including Germany, should much faster enter into the negative emissions. And what I see in most scenarios is that the negative emissions, the BECS and the direct CO2 capture, are a bit of a promise. So something we do somewhere in the future. But I think the developed countries should already start doing it now. Otherwise, we're just way too late. So it's more a comment than a question, I guess.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I totally agree. We used 2016 as a starting point because, the parties of the Paris Agreement then agreed to limit global warming, and we then divided like the share based on the population. But of course, like if you took into account all the historical emissions Germany have, we would have to become climate neutral 60 years ago, pretty much. So I totally agree. We have to do it as fast as we can, and to also start taking into account negative emissions. But as you mentioned before, Valérie, especially if it comes to technological ways of doing this, there are a lot of insecurities, and I really don't want to rely on that either.
But I think it's mainly a matter of money. So, and I think we should stop with postponing decisions because of money.
Yeah, I think, just for DAX, I think it's not only a question of money, it's also a question of how to massify in terms of how it would also modify the landscape, basically. I think the two existing plans today, I think there are two. Yeah, there's one in, I believe it's in Finland, or no, maybe not in Finland or Greenland, which is a unit which only captures, I think, 6 tons of CO2. No, it's not even 6 tons. It's less than 6 tons of CO2 per year, which is really nothing. And it's quite a big thing, so we would need to have a lot of not only units like that on the territory, but also reservoirs, and we are not sure at all to have that. It's really a big question.
It's very nice that we have a public that's already interacting and discussing fiercely. So please continue with that. So if you have any questions to our two speakers, then please ask them. You will get the microphone then as soon as possible. But let me first start with thanking you both for your nice presentations. And my first question would be, do you see any blind spots where information or data would be missing and more evaluations would be needed? You were discussing already a little bit, but perhaps you can give us as a community more heads up on that.
Okay, yeah. As I mentioned before, I think it would be very helpful to actually have like on time, like always very current evaluations about where we are going with the policies that are happening right now. However, I don't think that would be sufficient because I think we already have a lot of data. The gap we also have is getting these data to politicians or the people who are actually making the decisions, or at least get the pressure for them to listen to these data or to act according to it, because I see it every day. It's not happening.
And for me, I think some data is today missing in terms of quantifying the share of efficiency related to sufficiency. I mean, personally, I think it's quite difficult to exactly know how much is feasible in terms of decreasing energy demand by only sufficiency efforts or by only efficiency efforts. So, I think shedding some light on that type of data related to sufficiency could be quite interesting.
Okay, that's an interesting remark. I think we also know from research that energy use, especially in households, is not that price elastic. And by that I mean that it doesn't really mean anything to raise prices. Okay, if you rise them enough, of course, then that will have an impact. But normally small price increases would not have that much impact. So then you would expect that measures would help in reducing energy use. So, but if I understand you correctly, then you would say otherwise. Could you clarify a bit more then?
So not sure I got completely your question right. You mean that measures would not be enough? Well, I would say it's not only indeed a question of setting measures, it's also a question of understanding the whole, I would say, ecosystem in which those measures should be applied. So also dealing with how the individuals, whether it be people or companies, would react to these measures. I mean, maybe an example would be about the carbon tax, maybe. It's also required to have the information about how the benefit from the tax would be used. So it's a question of transparency, not only about the benefits from the tax, but generally speaking about the whole public finances. So yeah, it's measures plus consultation or discussions with the society. But I'm not sure I'm answering properly.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, it answers my question. Thank you. We can take another question from the audience, and after that we will go to the next speaker. So yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you both for your very interesting presentations. This is kind of two questions. First is, like, are the governments also working directly with businesses who can actually initiate the change? Because I live in Norway, and we pay in as part of our electricity grid net into a governmental body that's supposedly trying to push energy initiatives. And I think in the EU, it's been much further progressed than in the Schengen. But I was like, okay, I'm ready to reclad my house. I want a new roof. Can you advise me directly on what companies are good for working with in the climate that we're in? And so, like, can individuals immediately take action? Are you working with businesses to help them to push this forward? Because we really don't have much time.
I think, well, I think it really shows the need again to have efforts from both the individuals indeed and businesses, but also government actions and so on. So I'm not sure I do have the answer to that question myself, but I don't know if you would like to react to that, or I don't know.